since we can't agree on Lazarus, I'm curious if we could agree on Caiaphas. And the reason why I bring up Caiaphas, because you said, well, Pilate's the only guy that we can really anchor in. But we have the Caiaphas ossuary discovered in 1990, burial bone box of this priestly family. And here's the thing, the date of origin is 42 to 43. This is the same Caiaphas who would later preside over the trial of Jesus. Mr. Ellis, how can Caiaphas die in 43? Be alive during the ministry of Jesus at this time, and yet Jesus himself is crucified all the way in 70. Yet Caiaphas, who is alive during his ministry and presided over his trial, how can Caiaphas be dead at 42, 43? And we have archaeological evidence to that claim when you're saying it was way over here in 70. But what about Caiaphas?
Yeah.
The text tells us he was there, and the bone box tells us he was there. But you're saying, no, he's over there. Do you believe that Caiaphas lived in 70 as well?
No, when they rewrote this story back into the AD 30s, AD 20s, AD 30s, they would have to change certain elements of it to fit in with that chronology. So it's pretty obvious that they did. Therefore, they chose Pontius Pilate because he was an AD 30s character. And probably Caiaphas as well. He was 18 to 36, according to the reference I've got. So it wasn't in the 40s.
No. Hold on. The bone box, but the way my understanding of the way it works is not related to his death, but related to his reburial, because at this time they would bury them at first. So what you said as far as his death date, I'm not necessarily disputing that, but then they go in once there's basically only bones left, and then put what's left in that's why the ossuaries are sometimes nicknamed as bone boxes.
Yes.
So just some clarification to that, because maybe I gave the impression about his death date. If so, I apologize. But the bone box would originate or a 42, 43 as far as the bone box itself. That's when we would date that and understand that. But just to clarify. So I know what you're saying there.
Yeah,
but see, you're assuming your theory there, Mr. Ellis. You're assuming it's rewritten when I'm showing you a very real historical figure who's in the text multiple times, and we have hard archaeological data for. You're saying these people all the way over here knew who Caiaphas was, had the dates right, and then put him in the 30s. But you don't have any reasons why we should believe that's what happened when they're telling you.
We have lots of reasons. I mean, so you have these two characters, which are AD 30s characters, which they would have to change within the story to make it an AD 30s story. But we have a lot of information that is contradictory to that. Things like Saul putting the proto-Christians, the Nazarene, into jail. So Saul is going around Judea and sort of Syria as well, and he's persecuting the Church of Jesus and James and putting these people in prison and persecuting them unto death. Under what authority did Saul do that? Saul was a tent maker, yeah? So how was a tent maker putting these people in prison?
Okay, a few things. I feel like every time I've brought us to a place where we need to ask why we're not accepting the historical rootedness of it. We've got blood and nails and death and crosses, and now we've got bone boxes with Caiaphas. Every time we've got dead men who are wrapped up and stinking. Every time we go to that, you have some explanation, which is really more of an evasion. It sounds like to protect your theory, but I understand in the past you've changed your mind on things, and so I'm hoping maybe that'll happen again at some point with some of this. But now we're going to a new topic. Okay, I'll go there. We know that Paul did this under the authority of those who had authority in Jerusalem, and I've heard your theory that the tent maker, which is later on for Paul, during this time in life, it's not an indication that he needed to work as a tent maker during this time in his life. Later on, that was a skill or trade that is associated with him. I heard you say that it's actually a coded way to describe Paul as a Mason. So that means you have Paul as a Mason, but Paul is really Josephus, so Josephus is also a Mason, and Jesus is a Mason, and they're in this. So Jesus is a carpenter. Is that also secretly letting you know who he's a Mason? And do you know about Lazarus' occupation? Is that also telling you that he's secretly a Mason as well? And where in Josephus' writings do you see evidence that he was a Mason? Because if he's Paul, the tent maker, then he's a Mason too. But isn't he described as a general? I'm
Yeah,
very confused about about a lot of this, and maybe you can help me here.
I don't say that Saul was a Mason.
I heard you say that. I heard you say that. I heard you say. I did hear you say this.
No, the Mason bit comes from Jesus, who was called a tecton. He wasn't a carpenter, he was called a tecton, which is an architect, which is in the Greek, it's a name for a Mason. So Jesus was the Mason, not Saul. Saul was a tent maker. So the first question, I've got two questions about
Daniel Utterbrink. With Daniel Utterbrink, that's where you were talking about Paul, the tent maker. You were saying he's actually this powerful guy. And so he's not really just a tent maker.
Well, okay, if you want to go there.
The indication was he's secretly a Mason. You did say that with Daniel. I just listened to the debate.
No, I think you misunderstood. He was an important character, and that part of it comes from Acts 11:28, which I'm sure you can call up there, which says that, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, signified by the Spirit that there would be a great famine throughout the world. Which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And the question
Suetonius mentions him. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the question then is, who was Agabus? And the considered opinion of, again, myself and Professor Robert Eisenman is that Agabus is King Agabus of Edessa, because the queen of Edessa was Queen Helena, and it was Queen Helena in history who was known for giving the famine relief to Judea.
Right, but how does Acts 21:10 describe Agabus, though, Mr. Ellis?
Sorry, well, we're looking at 11:28 first.
Well, I know, but he's mentioned in other parts of Acts. You don't want to isolate it and say he's a king.
Agabus,
he's a prophet named who came from Judea.
Well, yes, because he was essentially at that point he was becoming the king of Judea. But there we go.
But when it says a prophet who came down from Judea, he's not the king of Judea. He's a prophet, and he gives a prophecy. He shows his function here. He says you're going to be bound up. If he was the king, he could have told Paul not to go and commanded him not to go. But Paul said, "I'm ready to die if I have to." But it says a prophet, right? He's not described as a king.
Well, some kings were prophets as well, just as Joseph was a prophet in Egypt.
Yeah, but where does it say he was a king, though? Where's his kingly action in Acts?
Because his name is Agabus, which is obviously Agabus, because both of these people gave the famine relief to Judea in the late AD 40s.
Okay, but how's it obvious that Agabus is Agabus? How's that obvious?
Because the wife of Agabus was Queen Helena, and the person who gave this famine relief money to Judea was Queen Helena. And here it's saying that her husband, King Agabus, actually in the Latin, he's called Agabus.
Is Helena ever described as being Agabus as the prophet's wife?
Yes, in Moses of Corine.
Okay.
Moses of Corine says that Queen Helena was married to King Agabus of Edessa.
But you're assuming prophet Agabus from Judea is that same person. I'm saying, where's your evidence that Agabus is actually Agabus? Because so far they sound like two different people. One's a king, one's a prophet, one's from Judea, one's from Edessa. Two different people.
No, not two different people. It's because Agabus, as you know, in the Greek means locust. And the Edessan monarchy were always called locusts because the various writers didn't actually like them, so they mocked them for being locusts. And of course, Agabus means locust. Exactly the same as within Josephus and other stories, they called them Arabs, which also means locust.
Well, wait. But Talmud, why would Luke mock the prophet here by calling him a name you're saying is intended to be mockery? Why would Luke do that?
All of these documents were influenced by Rome, because when were these documents written? They were written in the AD 70s, as you know.
Well, no. I do not know that, and I can tell you why I don't know that. And I'm sure you've heard this argument, but it's helpful for the audience if they haven't. The book of Acts, which is under discussion, ends with Paul on house arrest when we know Paul died under Nero. He died in a Neronian persecution.
Where does
Yet
it say that?
his death is not included. That's my point. It doesn't say it, indicating when this was no. That's the point.
It's like, not the point. It doesn't mention his death.
Let me give an example. It'd be like Revenge of the Sith. If he, well, let's not. I don't want to get too bogged down. But the point is, it doesn't mention his death because it hasn't happened yet, indicating it happened. This book is concluded prior to his death. So the evidence that you have is actually doesn't flow. And
no, it does flow.
And Acts is filled with accurate examples and representations of a lot of specific things that were specifically that time. Here's a great book on it, the Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history. Colin Himmer shows again and again and again, you have specific names that were and specific rulers and specific titles, but all kinds of things specific to a certain stage in history that match up. This is a wonderful book. I recommend people to get. It's a little bit dry, but he gives example after example. None of it matches up with what you're saying. It sounds like you're setting the Book of Acts in the entirely wrong historical timeline.
No, it does match up. We have Agabus, who's Agbarus, who's giving.
You have not established that, sir.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Who's married to Queen Helena, who gave the famine relief money to Judea. They come from Antioch, which is Antioch Edessa. That was the name of Edessa. And they were always called by the Talmud as well. They were called locusts, and of course Agabus does mean locusts. So we've got at least 4 or 5 pointers towards this being King Agabus of Edessa. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you read on, this famine relief money was taken to Judea by Saul and Barnabas. So if this was talking about the king of Edessa, which many people think, not just myself, then it means that Saul was actually much more important than people will give him credit for, because he was the ambassador to Edessa. So he was not a tent maker. So why do they call him a tent maker? Well, because Queen Helena was famed for having the biggest Sukkot in the whole of Judea. And a Sukkot is a tent. So Saul probably was a tent maker, but he was a Sukkot maker for the festival of Sukkots, the festival of the tabernacles, as you know. So all of this does tie in together in multiple sources, in multiple directions. If you have an open mind and you can accept it.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a way to, set up psychologically people to, say, well, I should believe this because Mr. Ellis says, if I'm open-minded, then I'll believe in his theory. But Mr. Ellis, I saw in your review of Eisenman, who you quoted, you said he wasn't open-minded enough. So he you quoted him in certain instances where he agrees with you, but in your review, you called out specifically, it's titled, not open-minded enough. So, I mean, I guess a lot of us aren't open-minded enough, but here, are you saying that you've got Agabus being Abgarus the Fifth? Is that the same one you're identifying him with?
Yes, indeed. Died in about AD 50. So this is talking about the right era, because this famine was supposed to be AD 48.
Okay, so you have Josephus, who is really Paul, being told by the king if he goes to Jerusalem that he's going to be killed. But don't you say that Agabus is actually the king of Judea? If he's the king, why would he be warning him against going to the place where he's the king of and saying he's going to get killed there? Because that does not make sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, because he was not allowed to go there by Roman edict. The Romans
then how's he the king?
Him. Yeah, but Rome controlled that region, and Rome said, don't you dare go.
But it says he came down from Judea. What do you mean he wasn't allowed to go there? He said he came down from Judea in the text of Acts. So he was allowed to go there in the text you brought us to.
But it says the word is katachome, which means to descend, come down or depart, or it can mean, in fact, in many cases, it's translated as the land. So it's not necessarily come down from.
It's a verb. In the root there is katothen, and it means to descend. Now, you said he wasn't allowed to go there, but how is he coming back from there if he's not allowed to go there on your theory?
it can also mean towards. So you can
Well,
translate that
if
in
he's
many
not allowed to
fashions.
go there, how can he be going towards it? Either way,
Because
you're in trouble. You
no,
said he's
because his
not allowed
wife
to go
did.
there.
His wife did. Queen Helena became the queen of Judea in the
Okay, but
AD 50s.
no, don't. We're changing the subject now. You
No.
said Agabus is not allowed to go to Jerusalem, even though you're saying he's the king of Judea. If you look in verse 12, it says the people there urged him not to go up to Jerusalem. So
Yes,
here
precisely.
you have the people hearing it saying, Paul, don't go because you'll be killed. Agabus,
Yes.
who you're saying is so, but notice you said Agabus he's warning him against going to a place that you're saying he's the king of. Wouldn't Agabus just be like, hey, Paul, if you want to go to Jerusalem, cool, I'm the king of it, I'll be in charge. But you say, no, he's not allowed to go there. But the text says he came down from Judea. How can he come from a place he wasn't allowed to be at?
If you read the other texts that talk about this, they say much the same thing in a slightly different fashion. They say that King Agabus of Edessa said he wants to come down to Judea to talk to Jesus, which is a problem because this is the AD 50s, of course. And then he was warned not to do so because that was against Roman law. So they're all talking about the same thing, and you're getting hung up on a single word when if you read the different versions, and there's like 5 different versions of this in the different texts, you will find a different interpretation.
Mr. Ellis, it says that Agabus came down from Judea. You just told us he was not allowed to be there.
Yes, you're harping on about one word.
Okay, so were you, it's okay, we all make mistakes, right? Are you saying you were mistaken that he was allowed to be there? Because it says he came down from there. And that's a phrase, by the way, not just one word. You said he's not allowed to be in Jerusalem. That's why he's warning Paul against going there, because he knows the Jews are going to hand him over. This is what the prophecy is about. Yeah, but you're saying he's not allowed to be there. But it says he came down from Judea.
Yeah, but what does down mean for you? Down would be what, south? Is that what you're saying? Is he going into Egypt? What does down mean?
It says he came down from Judea.
Yes. From Judea. Okay, so
they're in Caesarea. They're in Caesarea right now. They're in Caesarea. He came down from Judea. So how can he come from a place he's not allowed to be at?
I will have to give you a complete analysis of that because, of course, the other texts that we have don't say that in the same fashion.
Can you give me an example so I can look at it? Because maybe you're right.
Well,
if you give me just one, I'll take a look at it and maybe I'll verify it and I'll say, I'm sorry.
I'll probably give it to you after. It comes from documents like the Doctrine of Addai and things of that nature, which have the same sort of text.
You're saying they have the same account of Agabus, the prophet, warning Paul not to go to Jerusalem?
Yes, of course. Well, not in that terms, but it's talking about the same thing. It's talking about King Agabus writing letters down to Jesus.
Okay.
The story from
related to that.
But coming back to this, you haven't explained the other thing, which is, okay, if we're talking about a classical Saul, how was Saul persecuting people in Judea and Syria and committing them to prison if he was just a tent maker?
Okay.
See, you have problems with your classical interpretation as well. No,
I already mentioned this. At the time, he doesn't have to support himself as a tent maker. That's not what he's doing. He's not going all the way to Syria and saying, let me hook you up with a crib. He is saying, let me drag the Christian leaders and take them back to Jerusalem to be tried for crimes of heresy and blasphemy and all that kind of stuff. So that's easy. That's easy to explain. That doesn't really do anything. He's not described as a tent maker at this stage of his life. You're putting a detail from later on. He doesn't have the same job his whole life. When I was younger, I worked at Wendy's.
Yes, but you weren't a policeman,
I don't work at Wendy's anymore, And so you might be like, how can you afford that Tahoe when you work at Wendy's? I'm like, well, I don't work at Wendy's anymore. It'd be reversed with Paul.
You weren't a policeman, were you? It says of
Thank God, no.
It says, I persecuted this way unto death, binding and delivering into prison both
see, Mr. Ellis, that's a symbolic death. Oh. And see, that death is tacked on later. If you read the sentence carefully, there's a breathing mark. So now, we don't take that serious, that part.
You don't believe in symbolism, so explain it then in
Mr. Ellis, I'm being facetious. I'm using your methodology against you. I'm saying when you've got literal death, and I'm glad you can take it in good fun, you're okay with literal death in this instance. But when it seems clear in the text in other places, you say, well, that's tacked on.
Yes, but you believe in this in real terms. So explain it in real terms. How was Saul putting people to death? Under what authority?
Paul does breathe murderous threats.
Yes.
And he does bring him out to prison. And he describes himself as the chief of sinners. That's all true. But he says he did so with letters from the leaders in Jerusalem.
Acts 22:4. But yes, so under what authority? So he was a policeman then working for the authorities in Jerusalem, yes?
I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women,
yes,
as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those who also are there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. Now, at the time he was doing this, was Agabus king of Jerusalem, but not allowed there?
Well, that's a different matter, because he was under an edict from Rome. So that's a different matter. The point is,
edict from
Saul,
Rome? Where does it say that?
That in real history, you've got to read Procopius and various other.
Wait, you're saying Procopius is going to say that Paul was persecuting Christians on behalf of Rome?
That, King Agabus was under Roman restrictions. I think there are many manuscripts that say, even the Doctrine of Addai, I think, says that King Agabus of Edessa was under Roman restrictions. But the point here is talking about Saul. If Saul was Josephus, then we know exactly how he became the policeman in charge of Judea and, well, this says Syria all the way up to Damascus, because Saul was the army commander in charge of Galilee, as you know.
Well, Mr. Ellis, being a cop and being a general are two very different things.
No, not in most times.
You can't have Paul persecuting these kind of religious legal matters on behalf of folks in Jerusalem and equate that with Josephus's job as a general.
Josephus was appointed by the high priesthood in Jerusalem to police Judea and as far as Gamala in the north. And what he was doing is he was persecuting a guy called Jesus of Gamala Saphias, and he was chasing him and jailing him all over Galilee at that time.
So Paul was actually chasing Jesus.
Well, he was. Saul,
but why doesn't it say that? It says, I persecuted this way. It doesn't say I was chasing Jesus.
Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who said that?
Jesus from heaven.
Well, yes, if you believe in heavens, but we're talking about real.
Well, okay, let's just take. Okay, I understand. From what I've heard, you're saying you don't believe in heaven, but you do believe in magic stones. From what I've read in relationship to something that Scotland is supposed to have.
No, I don't.
Okay, then maybe I misunderstood about the magic stone.
Well, this is detractors. You don't believe detractors. I mean,
okay.
This is the first rule of anything to do.
I'll take your my mistake.
I talk about these magic stones. Well, they're not magic; they're magnetic. I talk about.
I understand.
Them. That doesn't mean that you believe in them.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, in relationship to this, in the account, Jesus is described as being the risen Lord and speaking to him in a very way that's reminiscent of the way an Old Testament prophet would have a vision. And as I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground. I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth. But of course, Ralph, you would need him to say, I am the king of Edessa, whom you are persecuting. So he's described there
at that time. He wouldn't have been king at that time, I don't think.
But do you believe where do you believe Jesus is speaking from? Because it says a great light from heaven shone around me. So how's Jesus?
Only if you believe in heavens. I don't believe in these spiritual.
Well, Paul seemed to believe in heaven. He says he even got caught up to it. So what do you think Paul is saying here? Is he actually saying that the king of Edessa approached him the prince at this time, under your theory, the prince of Edessa approached him and said, stop chasing me? And why would Paul just suddenly stop chasing him when his quarry is right in front of him?
Josephus says exactly the same when he was imprisoned in self-imprisoned in Jotapata when he was being attacked by the Romans. And he says exactly the same thing. He says that he had a vision of a man telling him the error of his ways and he ought to change his ways in exactly the same fashion as this Saul having his little
Could I look at that reference?
revelation. Sorry?
That reference is in Josephus. I got Josephus. Where are you saying it is?
Oh gosh, that's going to take me a while to pick that out.
Because I'm a little worried maybe something else is going on there. I'm not saying for sure. It's good to always verify, right? And
well, yes, but I don't want to take ages looking this up for people. Let me see if I can pull out my book, because that's going to be the easiest way to find it.
If you find it, let me know, because it might be something different. But you're saying,
well, I mean, it's a very simple passage. He was imprisoned in Jotapata because they were defeated by the Romans, and so they retreated into some sort of underground cell. And then he says, because he wants to surrender to the Romans, and the people he's with don't want to surrender to the Romans, and he has this vision of a man saying that you should basically go over to the Romans, surrender and go over to the Romans. But his compatriots don't want to, and so he devises this wonderful little scheme where everybody commits suicide. But
you're talking about and he's the only guy who doesn't. He tricks him.
The only one who doesn't, because he's choosing who commits suicide. He ends up as the last man standing.
Right. So I know that story, but how's that the same story of what you're telling me? I know he kind of did a little sellout there, he tricked them and all that. Okay, but that's in a cave.
Yes. And
but you said he was in prison or in jail,
telling him of the error of his ways, and he should go over to the Romans. And I don't know quite how I can find this in a quick hurry for you.
Let's see, anyway, Jewish Wars of the Jews, Book 3.
Oh, probably.
Chapter 8. Let's see here. But are you saying that this is the same account of Paul with the risen Jesus?
I can't say it's the same account. It's a very similar account, and you find these very similar events at time and time again that confirm that Saul was the Josephus character, the same as we find that Saul was on a ship that was shipwrecked going to Rome in order to see Nero. And of course, Josephus was shipwrecked on a ship going to Rome to go and see Nero. Both of those were prison ships as well. And they were at the same time. They were both in about AD 62. So we have these very close connections between these two characters. So from your point of view, do you think that's just coincidence that they're both on the same ship?
Well, I'd have to look at it, because I feel like when you look at a text, you see connections that that maybe someone with a different methodology or historiography would not see. And so I'm not assuming that the framing is correct there. And I'm sure you know that there's a lot of people who went on ships to Rome and got shipwrecked, even in that year. So that's not really relevant, especially when they have two different names. And Saul is from Tarsus. Josephus is not from Tarsus. Saul studied under Gamaliel. Josephus did not study under Gamaliel. You've got to import Josephus's biography onto Paul's life, or vice versa, for this thing to work. You've got to have was Josephus of the tribe of Benjamin? I don't believe that he was. Now maybe maybe I'm wrong, and that's something I could say. Oh, I was wrong about that.
To the Hasmoneans. But I mean, there are many similarities. You're looking at the things that don't quite connect, but how about looking at the things that do connect?
You're asking me to buy into your theory with that.
Oh, no, this is to fully explore something, you explore the negatives and the positives. And one of the positives, of course, is they both had the same publisher, Epaphroditus. Is that a coincidence that they were both using Epaphroditus, and it seems to be the same Epaphroditus in both cases?
Can you explain to me? Can you tell me where the sources are for that? That they both had the same publisher?
Well, it comes from Acts of the Apostles. Where's Epaphroditus mentioned?
I'm trying to see some of the connections.
2:25. Epaphroditus, my brother, and
okay, so where does it say he's his publisher there?
Because, well, in Josephus Flavius, he salutes him as being a fellow traveler in this scheme of theirs, which is writing these books. It's pretty obvious that Epaphroditus was working with him, because the thing is that Josephus
Yeah, fellow worker. You're correct about that.
Worker.
But where's this idea of publisher?
Well, because Josephus couldn't speak Greek very well, and he needed someone to translate these books into Greek. They were not written in Greek in the first place. They were written in Aramaic, as he makes very clear. And since Josephus couldn't write Greek very well, he needed someone in order to assist him. And it's quite obvious that that person was Epaphroditus, in which case I call him his publisher. If you're writing these books, you know, Josephus wrote enormous books, as you know. He would have a whole team of scribes doing this. He would have a whole scriptorium and a publishing empire in order to print these books. It was very expensive. And he was distributing these books, firstly to Edessa. All of the first books he wrote about the Jewish war went to Edessa. The Babylonian Jews beyond the Euphrates. And the subsequent books he was trying to give to the Romans to prove that, because he said there were errors running abroad about the Jewish revolt, and he wanted to correct those errors. And so the second load of books went to Greece and to Rome. In order
we don't have evidence that that all these Epaphroditus are the same people. We've got one that Josephus dedicates his book Antiquities of the Jews. So I'm looking up now. And we have another one, and maybe this is the one you're conflating with all three being the same person, who was a secretary of Nero.
Yes, which could be the same person again.
Yeah, but just because they have the same name doesn't mean they're the same person. And here's the thing. Do you believe that Paul was executed under Nero?
No, there is no evidence, is there? What's your evidence that he was?
I mean...
Well, you know, come on. What's your evidence? What's your written evidence?
So there's a few things. One is, as I mentioned before, Acts closes with Paul still alive.
Yeah, that's
but he's under lock and key during that time. But then later on, you have pretty early church tradition that talks about Paul being executed under Nero.
Yeah, that's not evidence from that era.
Well, some of the hold on. If we're gonna do that, you understand that first of all, Josephus. Well, okay, you're shifting over the whole date, which is wild, but you would have other things you've drawn from so far that are not contemporaneous to this time, especially like the Talmud. You know, you've done that several times, and the Talmud is, you know, kind of completed for time of the Babylonian time, 500 AD.
Yes,
but nonetheless,
we'll argue about that. Yes,
but nonetheless, my point by bringing that up is, you know, he's working with Nero, and you're yet making him work with Paul, but it's not even clear that that's the same Epaphroditus, and it's not even clear that Josephus is Paul. That's probably the biggest problem that we have here with all that, and all this is really tied into your theories. And if you take out one of them, it creates some other big problems with your theories. If you wanted to just slide over the dates of the New Testament, I guess, you know, that might be an interesting escapade. But the fact that you conflate so many persons of history, where you take 2 or 3 or 4 people and put them into one, that's where you really get your problems. Because it seems as if you're willing to take people with similar names, say they're definitely the same people, if the names are similar or in some cases identical. But Mr. Ellis, you are willing to take people whose names, biographies are not similar at all, and say they're the same person simply because their lives have some element of parallel that you believe you found.
No, with the Saul Josephus connection, I have about 15 parallels between the two. So this is not a simple comparison of 1 or 2 events. I have a whole series of events that link these two characters together.
Did Josephus study under Gamaliel?
He has a very similar story with a different name, so we're not sure on that. Yeah, of course, with all of these elements, you will find 1 or 2 contradictions, and you're picking out the contradictions, which is a good thing. You're showing the opposite point of view. But there are, I give you at least 15 comparisons between these 2 characters, so I don't connect them lightly. And the other point is that it makes sense of the story. You have a classical story of Saul, where this guy is completely missing from the historical record.
Well, no, he's not. But can I show you some more problems with the Josephus thing? Josephus, because I just wanted to confirm. Remember, I asked you earlier if he was a Levi or a Benjamite. The answer is no, he's not. He's from the tribe of Levi. But yet, in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, Paul says he's from the tribe of Benjamin.
Yeah.
So how can Josephus and Paul be the same person if one is a Levite and one is a Benjamite? Those aren't. That's not a minor difference.
Yeah, but as you know, the genealogy of Jesus is completely different in two of the Gospels.
Well, I'm not asking about Jesus. I'm asking about Paul and Josephus.
This is how the Gospels are not entirely accurate.
I'm reading from Philippians, not a gospel. Yeah. Everything you're saying is irrelevant to my question to you, sir.
No, the whole of the gospel story is not necessarily fixed in stone. So you're quoting something from Philippians. I'm quoting a genealogy from the rest of the synoptic gospels, and the two genealogies do not match. So the fact that we have a genealogy that doesn't match does not prove that Saul.
This is not a genealogy. This is Paul when he's giving his pre-Christian credentials. Says I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. Josephus, by his own account, says that his father was a Jewish priest. He's a Levite. So how do you explain that these two people you're saying are one have two different dads and are from two different tribes? What's your explanation?
How do you know he was quoting his father's line? You know, as you know,
genealogy. Josephus says his mother was also a Levite. He says his and
sure?
Yes. Let's see here.
I'm not entirely sure that he does. But as you know, these genealogies are not precise. The genealogy of Jesus proves that. And he's supposed to be an even more important character than Saul is. And they still can't get the genealogy of Jesus to be the same.
But we're asking about Josephus here. We're asking about Josephus, right?
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So here's another a difference here. Okay, it looks like I'm not sure if she's a Levite, but she is from a royal ruling family. Aristocratic, but I do believe she was a Levite as well. But I'm not 100% sure on that.
They're Levites.
But see, you should have looked this up to confirm your theory. Here I'm telling you, one's a Levite, one's a Benjamite. You don't have a ready answer. Not only that, but you have other problems here with this Josephus Paul thing, namely that they have two different names.
Yes, but Paul just means the junior. So Paul is not a name. That's just his position. He's the junior. He's the younger brother. And Saul, Josephus could not use his name when he was writing about himself in some of these texts. You'll find this problem all the time, that certain names have been deleted. We get this from Josephus when he's talking about the Edessans. So very quickly, when he talks about the Edessans, when Aretas was attacking Tetrarch Antipas, Josephus says that Aretas of Petra was joined by some fugitives from Syria. And so he's not giving the name of this alternative army that helped Aretas of Petra. And then you go to Moses of Corinne, who has exactly the same story. And he says it was the Edessan army that helped Aretas of Petra defeat Tetrarch Antipas. So we have two stories. And in the Josephan story, he deliberately deletes the people who were in this battle. He will not mention Edessa. And that is a problem that we find all the way through his works. You can do a search of the works of Josephus, and he never mentions Edessa. He never mentions Abgarus. He never mentions Manu. He never mentions anything to do with the Edessan monarchy.
Right, but that's not a problem for us. It's a problem for you.
Right? It's a problem for us because he may well be mentioning these people all the way through his works, and you would not know about it because he's using pseudonyms.
But you know.
Well, I know because, well, we know he is missing out this particular monarchy. He's not mentioning them.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of places he doesn't mention, though, Mr. Ellis.
Sorry?
There's a lot of places Josephus doesn't mention, but that doesn't mean there's some secret code that tells you how they really are there. Well, here's the other thing with this. Josephus is a Sadducee. What is Paul, though? What's his affiliation? Not a Sadducee, but a...
Well, no. Well, we can talk about this later because they seem to
what's the
change
answer?
their minds. Well, no, there is no guaranteed answer.
Philippians 3, he says a Pharisee of Pharisees.
Yes, but he also has elements of Sadducee as well.
Okay,
you know that
he calls himself a Pharisee. Josephus is a Sadducee. How are they the same person?
They change their alliances. You know that the things he says are allied to both of them. The people we're talking about, the Jesus of Gamala, they were the sons of Zadok, and so they should be Sadducees, as you know, the Zadoks. But they are not always allied with the Zadoks. There were obviously shifting alliances, and you can see that in the text. So putting that forward as a black and white, question is simply not fair. You know that they had shifting alliances. They're not always talking in Pharisee terms. I can point you to articles that point that out, but I don't want to get bogged down in minutiae of these texts. But I think I've demonstrated to you sufficiently that there are a number of links between Josephus and Saul which indicate they might be linked. And if that is the case, then we are talking about a later date for the gospel story.
Okay, two things about that, though, Mr. Ellis. Paul, later on, cannot even go into Jerusalem unless he's willing to be bound and perhaps killed. We've been over that passage relating to Agabus. But if he's a Sadducee, he should be okay to go into Jerusalem, if he's actually Josephus, because that's something to bring up, too. But not only that, in Acts 23:6, he says, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Two things about that. Number one, he declares to a body of Pharisees and Sadducees, he affiliates as a Pharisee and as a son of Pharisees. Josephus is not a son of Pharisees. So more problems for your theory. And then he proclaims resurrection of the dead. Mr. Ellis, did Sadducees believe in a bodily resurrection of the dead?
Mr. Vocab, you know full well that Saul was the apostle to the Gentiles. So we're talking about a completely different church here. He was
church. He's on trial here.
Yeah, he was on trial for preaching against the against Judaism, wasn't he? When Saul was put into prison, he was put into prison for preaching texts which were against Judaism. That's why he was put into jail, because he was the apostle to the Gentiles. You know, he became the apostle to the Gentiles. He was promoting a Rome-friendly form of Judaism, which the Jerusalem authorities didn't like. That's why they put him in prison. So you know that he was not just simply a Pharisee. So asking me that question is a trick
you didn't answer the question, and you know very well Sadducees did not believe in the bodily resurrection of the dead, but he's proclaiming the bodily resurrection of the dead. So he's not Josephus the Sadducee. That's all I'm saying. He's not.
But he was Saul the apostle to the Gentiles, which is something completely different.
Amen.
So he set up a Rome-friendly form of Judaism, which I call simple Judaism, the Church of Saul, which was completely different, of course, to the Church of Jesus and James. They actually became enemies, as you know. And who within history of this region became very Rome-friendly? Yes, that would be Josephus, wouldn't it? Who was also very Rome-friendly. Again, we see similarities between these two people. Now, in some senses, this doesn't change the Christian story. I mean, you're hanging on to this traditional view of Christianity with the AD 30s crucifixion.
Well, you're hanging on to your theory from your books, though. So to be fair,
you can say that, but my story doesn't actually change that story very much whatsoever. All it means is the date slips by 40 years, and then we place this Jesus character in a place where we can find characters who are very similar to the Jesus character.